Picture this. You've just brought in 12 Fortune 500 companies as clients, generating millions in revenue for your company. Your boss calls you into his office, and instead of a promotion or bonus, he slashes your salary by 70%. But that's not even the crazy part. Within 24 hours, all 12 clients mysteriously disappear from your portfolio. What would you do? Well, let me tell you what happened to me, because this story gets a lot darker than corporate betrayal. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 years ago, I was working as a senior account executive at Meridian Solutions, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Chicago. The company specialized in digital transformation services for large corporations, and I'd been there for about 4 years, steadily climbing the ladder. My name is Jake Morrison, and at 28, I thought I had my career mapped out perfectly. Meridian wasn't exactly a household name, but we had solid clients and decent revenue. The problem was, we were stuck in that uncomfortable middle ground, where we were too big to be scrappy and too small to compete with the major players like McKinsey or Deloitte. Our client roster consisted mainly of regional businesses and a handful of mid-tier national companies. The Fortune 500 contracts were like unicorns. Everyone talked about landing them, but nobody had actually done it. My direct supervisor was Patricia Hendricks, a sharp woman in her early 40s who'd been with the company since its founding 8 years earlier. Patricia was tough but fair, and she'd taken me under her wing when I first joined the team. Above her was the regional director, Marcus Chen, who reported directly to the CEO and founder, Richard Blackwood. Blackwood was one of those larger-than-life executive types who drove a Tesla Model S, wore custom Italian suits, and had photos of himself with various politicians and business leaders covering his office walls. He'd started Meridian after leaving a senior position at a Fortune 100 company, and he never let anyone forget about his corporate pedigree. The guy had an MBA from Wharton and name-dropped it in every conversation. The culture at Meridian was intensely competitive. We had monthly performance reviews, quarterly rankings, and an annual survivor program where the bottom 10% of performers were let go. It sounds harsh, but it kept everyone sharp. The compensation was good. I was making $85,000 a year plus bonuses, which wasn't bad for Chicago, especially for someone my age. Everything changed in March when I attended the National Business Development Conference in Las Vegas. It was a massive event with over 5,000 attendees, including executives from practically every major corporation in America. Meridian had sent me as part of a 3-person team, along with Patricia and another senior executive named David Kumar. The conference was held at the Bellagio, and the networking opportunities were incredible. On the second day, I found myself in a conversation with Jennifer Walsh, the VP of Strategic Initiatives at Pinnacle Industries, a Fortune 200 manufacturing company based in Detroit. She was complaining about their current consulting firm's lack of innovation and responsiveness. Instead of just exchanging business cards like most people do at these events, I spent 45 minutes really listening to her challenges. Pinnacle was struggling with outdated inventory management systems across their 12 manufacturing facilities. Their current consultant had proposed a cookie-cutter solution that would take 18 months to implement and cost nearly $8 million. I sketched out a preliminary approach on a cocktail napkin that would leverage existing infrastructure and reduce both timeline and costs by about 40%. Jennifer was intrigued enough to schedule a formal presentation for the following month. That conversation led to another, and another. By the end of the 4-day conference, I had solid leads with executives from 11 more Fortune 500 companies. These weren't just business card exchanges. These were substantive conversations about real problems that Meridian could solve. When I got back to Chicago, I immediately started working on proposals. I stayed late every night for 2 weeks, researching each company's specific challenges, analyzing their financial reports, and crafting customized solutions. Patricia noticed my dedication and started checking in regularly, offering feedback and resources. The first breakthrough came with Pinnacle Industries. Jennifer loved our proposal and convinced her board to sign a 3-year contract worth $4.2 million. The announcement sent shockwaves through Meridian. We'd never landed anything close to that size before, but that was just the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, I closed deals with Atlantic Retail Group for $2.8 million, Coastal Energy Corporation for $3.1 million, and Midwest Financial Services for $2.4 million. Each success built momentum for the next pitch. Word was spreading in executive circles about this boutique firm in Chicago that was delivering Fortune 500 results at mid-market prices. By July, I had signed all 12 Fortune 500 companies I'd met at the Vegas conference. The total contract value was over $38 million, more than double Meridian's previous annual revenue. The local business press picked up the story, and I was featured in Chicago Business Journal as Rising Star of the Year. Richard Blackwood was practically floating on air. He called an all-hands meeting to announce the contracts and made a big show of praising my work. He talked about how this was the beginning of a new era for Meridian, how we were now playing in the big leagues, and how everyone in the company would benefit from this success. The immediate changes were noticeable. We moved to a larger office in a more prestigious building downtown. Blackwood hired 6 new senior consultants and doubled the size of our research team. The company logo got a redesign, and suddenly our marketing materials featured phrases like "trusted by Fortune 500 leaders" and "elite strategic consulting." My colleagues treated me differently too. Some were genuinely congratulatory and excited about the opportunities these contracts would create. Others seemed resentful, whispering about how I'd gotten lucky, or wondering if I'd somehow cut corners. The competitive culture that had once motivated everyone was now creating divisions. Patricia was thrilled, but also concerned. She pulled me aside one afternoon in late July and said something that stuck with me. "Jake, you've accomplished something remarkable, but be careful. Success this big changes dynamics in ways you might not expect. Just watch your back and document everything." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I was riding high on the success and already planning my next moves. I figured I'd get promoted to Patricia's level, maybe even become the youngest regional director in company history. I started looking at apartments in nicer neighborhoods and even considered buying a new car. The contracts themselves were complex but manageable. Each Fortune 500 client had different needs and timelines. Pinnacle Industries wanted us to start with a pilot program at their Detroit facility before rolling out to other locations. Atlantic Retail needed us to integrate with their existing IT infrastructure during their slow season to minimize disruption. Coastal Energy required specialized expertise in regulatory compliance that we'd need to develop. I threw myself into the work with the same intensity I'd brought to landing the contracts. I was putting in 70-hour weeks, coordinating with client teams across different time zones, and managing a growing team of junior consultants who'd been assigned to support the Fortune 500 projects. The early results were encouraging. Pinnacle's pilot program was showing promising efficiency gains. Atlantic's initial integration phase was ahead of schedule. Coastal Energy's compliance team was impressed with our understanding of their regulatory environment. Every client check-in reinforced that we were on the right track. But as summer turned to fall, I started noticing subtle changes in how I was being treated at Meridian. Richard Blackwood, who had been effusive in his praise just months earlier, became more distant. Our weekly one-on-ones were shortened and sometimes canceled altogether. When he did meet with me, the conversations felt perfunctory, like he was going through the motions. Marcus Chen, the regional director, started micromanaging aspects of the Fortune 500 projects that he'd never shown interest in before. He wanted detailed weekly reports on every client interaction, copies of all correspondence, and approval for any expenditure over $500. When I asked Patricia about it, she just shrugged and said the executive team was probably feeling pressure to make sure everything went perfectly. The first real warning sign came in early September. I was in Detroit for a quarterly review meeting with Pinnacle Industries when I got a call from David Kumar back in Chicago. He told me that Blackwood had held an impromptu senior staff meeting and announced some organizational restructuring that would be implemented over the next few months. When I got back to Chicago the next day, I tried to schedule time with Blackwood to discuss the changes, but his assistant said he was booked solid for the next 2 weeks. Patricia seemed unusually tense and kept deflecting my questions about what exactly was being restructured. The atmosphere in the office was becoming increasingly strange. Colleagues who used to stop by my desk for casual conversations were now avoiding eye contact. The junior consultants on my team started coming to me with concerns about mixed messages they were getting from other senior staff about project priorities. In mid-September, I discovered that Marcus Chen had been having direct conversations with several of my Fortune 500 clients without including me. When I confronted him about it, he claimed it was just relationship maintenance and that I shouldn't read too much into it. But Jennifer Walsh from Pinnacle mentioned during a phone call that Marcus had asked some unusual questions about their satisfaction with my performance and whether they'd be open to working with other team members. That's when I started documenting everything, just like Patricia had suggested. I kept copies of all client communications, recorded the details of every internal meeting, and maintained a log of any unusual interactions with colleagues or supervisors. Something was definitely happening, but I couldn't figure out what or why. The bombshell dropped on a Tuesday morning in early October. I arrived at the office to find an email from HR requesting that I attend a meeting at 10 a.m. with Richard Blackwood and the head of Human Resources, Sandra Mills. The subject line simply read, "Compensation Review." I assumed it was finally time for the promotion and raise I'd been expecting. After all, I'd just brought in more business than anyone in company history. I spent the morning reviewing my achievements and preparing talking points about my vision for the next phase of growth. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. When I walked into Blackwood's office at 10 sharp, the atmosphere was ice cold. Sandra Mills was there with a folder of documents, and Blackwood was sitting behind his desk with the kind of serious expression you'd expect at a funeral. "Jake, please have a seat," Blackwood said, without any of his usual pleasantries. "We need to discuss some changes to your compensation structure." I sat down, expecting to hear about a significant raise or bonus structure tied to the Fortune 500 contracts. Instead, Blackwood slid a document across the desk that made my stomach drop. "Effective immediately, your base salary is being reduced from $85,000 to $25,000 annually. You'll be transitioned to a commission-only structure for any new business you generate moving forward." I stared at the document, certain I was misreading something. A 70% pay cut after bringing in $38 million in new business? "I don't understand," I said, my voice probably sounding smaller than I intended. "Is this some kind of mistake?" Sandra Mills cleared her throat and opened her folder. "Jake, we've had some concerns brought to our attention regarding your client relationships and the sustainability of the contracts you've secured. The executive team has decided that a commission-based structure better aligns with the company's risk management strategy." "What concerns?" I asked, my confusion turning to anger. "Every single one of my clients is ahead of schedule and reporting positive results. The contracts are solid and the relationships are strong." Blackwood leaned back in his chair with an expression I'd never seen before, cold and calculating. "Jake, you're still young in this business. Sometimes what looks like success in the short term doesn't translate to long-term value. We're making this change to protect both you and the company." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it was clear that the decision had already been made. No amount of arguing or evidence was going to change their minds. I was given 48 hours to review and sign the new compensation agreement or face termination. I left that meeting in a daze. $25,000 a year wouldn't even cover my rent, let alone my other expenses. I'd gone from being the company's golden boy to essentially being told I was worthless overnight. That evening, I called Patricia to see if she knew what was really going on. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near the office the next morning, away from any potential eavesdropping. "Jake, I've been trying to figure out how to warn you about this," she said, looking genuinely distressed. "There's been a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that you haven't been privy to. Blackwood and Chen have been planning this for weeks." She explained that the executive team had become concerned about my growing influence with the Fortune 500 clients. They were worried that if I decided to leave Meridian, I might take the clients with me. The salary cut was designed to either force me out immediately or make me so financially dependent on commissions that I'd never be able to leave. "But that doesn't make any sense," I protested. "Why not just promote me and give me equity in the company? That would align my interests with theirs." Patricia gave me a look that suggested I was being naive. "Jake, you brought in more business in 6 months than Blackwood did in his last 3 years at his previous company. Some people don't handle that kind of threat to their ego very well." The next morning, I was planning to spend the day reviewing the new contract and figuring out my options when I got a call that changed everything. It was Jennifer Walsh from Pinnacle Industries, and she sounded upset. "Jake, I need to ask you about something strange that happened yesterday. We received a call from someone at your company claiming that you were no longer authorized to work on our account and that all future communications should go through Marcus Chen. Can you explain what's going on?" My blood ran cold. I assured Jennifer that there had been some kind of miscommunication and that I'd get back to her within the hour. But before I could even process what was happening, my phone rang again. This time, it was the procurement director at Atlantic Retail Group with an almost identical story. Over the next 3 hours, I received calls from representatives at all 12 Fortune 500 companies I'd signed. Each one had been contacted by someone from Meridian's executive team and told that I was no longer their primary point of contact. Some were confused, others were concerned, and a few were genuinely angry about being kept in the dark about changes to their account management. I tried calling Marcus Chen to find out what was happening, but his assistant said he was in meetings all day. When I went to Blackwood's office, I was told he was out of town at a client site. Sandra Mills from HR was unavailable, according to her voicemail. By the end of that day, the picture was becoming clear. While I was dealing with the shock of my salary cut, the executive team had moved quickly to insert themselves between me and my clients. They were positioning themselves as the primary relationship owners, while I was still trying to figure out whether to sign the new compensation agreement. But the real shock was yet to come. That Wednesday morning started like any other, except I woke up with a knot in my stomach that hadn't been there since college finals week. I'd barely slept, running through scenarios of how to handle the client situation and whether I should sign the new compensation agreement or start looking for another job. I decided to get to the office early and try to intercept some of the calls before the executive team could do any more damage. But when I arrived at 7:30, Marcus Chen was already there, sitting in the conference room with his laptop open and what looked like client files spread across the table. He looked up when I walked past, and for a moment we just stared at each other through the glass wall. Then he got up, closed the conference room door, and pulled the blinds shut. Whatever he was working on, he clearly didn't want me to see it. I went to my desk and immediately started calling my Fortune 500 contacts. The first 3 calls went straight to voicemail, which was unusual since these executives typically answered their phones during business hours. The 4th call was answered by an assistant who told me that her boss was unavailable for the foreseeable future, and that all Meridian-related inquiries should be directed to Marcus Chen. This was escalating faster than I'd imagined possible. I pulled up my email to send messages directly to my client contacts, but when I tried to access my company email account, I got an error message saying my credentials were invalid. I tried logging in again, thinking I'd mistyped my password, but got the same result. I walked over to Patricia's office, but she wasn't in yet. Her assistant said she'd called in sick, which was strange because Patricia never took sick days. I tried calling her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. By 9 a.m., other employees were starting to arrive, and I noticed several of them looking at me strangely. David Kumar, who I'd worked closely with on several projects, walked right past my desk without acknowledging me. When I called out to him, he just waved vaguely and kept walking. At 9:15, Sandra Mills from HR appeared at my desk with 2 security guards I'd never seen before. "Jake, I need you to come with me to my office," she said in a tone that suggested this wasn't a request. The walk to HR felt like a death march. Other employees stopped their conversations and watched as I was escorted across the office floor. When we got to Sandra's office, she gestured for me to sit down while the security guards positioned themselves by the door. "Jake, we've discovered some irregularities in your client communications that require immediate investigation," Sandra began, reading from a prepared statement. "While this investigation is ongoing, your access to company systems and client accounts has been suspended." "What irregularities?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew this was a manufactured drama to justify what they'd already decided to do. Sandra handed me a folder containing printouts of email exchanges I'd had with various clients over the past few months. Someone had gone through and highlighted certain phrases and sentences, though I couldn't see any pattern to what they'd selected. "These communications suggest you may have been positioning yourself as the sole point of contact for these accounts, potentially undermining other team members and creating dependency relationships that could be detrimental to the company." I flipped through the emails, recognizing them as routine client updates and project coordination messages. There was nothing in any of these communications that was inappropriate or problematic. They were highlighting things like, "I'll personally ensure this gets resolved," and "Feel free to call me directly if you have any concerns." Standard customer service language. "Sandra, these are completely normal client communications. Every account manager in this company sends emails like this every day." She continued reading from her script as if I hadn't spoken. "Additionally, we've received reports that you may have made unauthorized promises to clients regarding timelines and deliverables that exceed your authority level." This was getting surreal. I'd been meticulous about staying within approved parameters on all my client commitments. Every major decision had been reviewed by Patricia and documented in our project management system. "I want to see these reports," I said. "Who made these allegations?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the sources of our information. What I can tell you is that effective immediately, you're being placed on administrative leave pending the completion of our investigation." The security guard stepped forward, and I realized this conversation was over whether I wanted it to be or not. I was escorted back to my desk to collect my personal belongings under supervision, then walked out of the building I'd entered as an employee just 2 hours earlier. Standing on the sidewalk outside Meridian's office building, I felt completely disoriented. In less than 48 hours, I'd gone from being the company's top performer to being essentially fired under suspicious circumstances. The whole situation felt like a bad dream. I drove home and spent the rest of the morning trying to make sense of what had happened. I pulled up LinkedIn and started reaching out to my network, trying to get a better understanding of what was being said about me in professional circles. Most people responded normally, but a few seemed oddly distant in their replies. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Jennifer Walsh from Pinnacle Industries, and she sounded confused and frustrated. "Jake, I've been trying to reach you all morning. We had a conference call scheduled with your team at 11, but nobody from Meridian showed up. When I called the main number, they told me you were no longer with the company. What's going on?" I explained that there had been some internal changes and that I was temporarily not handling her account, but that the project would continue with other team members. Even as I said it, I realized how inadequate that explanation sounded. Jake, I need to be direct with you. We signed this contract because of you and your team's specific approach to our challenges. If you're not going to be involved, we need to seriously reconsider our agreement with Meridian. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process the implications of what Jennifer had just said. If Pinnacle pulled out of their contract, it would create a domino effect with the other Fortune 500 clients. They'd all signed on based on their confidence in me personally, not just in Meridian as a company. Over the next few hours, I received similar calls from executives at 5 more of my Fortune 500 clients. Each conversation followed the same pattern: confusion about my status, concern about project continuity, and veiled threats about reconsidering their contracts. By evening, I was starting to understand the real scope of what Blackwood and his team had done. They'd manufactured a crisis to justify removing me from client relationships, but they hadn't thought through the consequences. These weren't typical B2B service contracts where clients just cared about getting the work done. These were relationship-based agreements where trust and personal connections were central to the value proposition. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 unread text messages. Something big had happened overnight, but I couldn't figure out what until I started going through the messages. The first text was from a number I didn't recognize. "Jake, this is Tom Bradley from Coastal Energy. Call me immediately. We're pulling out of our contract with Meridian." The second message was from Atlantic Retail Group's procurement director. "Jake, need to talk ASAP. We're terminating our agreement effective immediately." As I scrolled through the messages, a pattern emerged. All 12 of my Fortune 500 clients had decided, apparently within hours of each other, to cancel their contracts with Meridian. The total value of the canceled business was over $38 million. I called Jennifer Walsh first, since she'd been my initial contact and had always been straightforward with me. "Jake, I'm glad you called. I need to explain what happened yesterday after we talked." About an hour after our conversation, I got a call from Richard Blackwood himself. He told me that you had been terminated for violating company policies and attempting to steal client information. My heart sank. Blackwood had gone nuclear, actively sabotaging my reputation with clients. Jennifer continued, "He said that Meridian would be assigning a new team to our account, but when I asked for details about the transition plan, he couldn't give me specifics. It became clear that they hadn't actually prepared for your departure at all. So you decided to cancel the contract?" "Jake, our board met in an emergency session yesterday evening. The consensus was that if Meridian was willing to make such drastic changes to our account team without consulting us, and if they were having internal personnel issues serious enough to result in termination of their lead account manager, we couldn't trust them to deliver on their commitments." The conversation with Jennifer lasted 20 minutes, and by the end, I understood that the other 11 clients had gone through similar decision-making processes. Word had spread quickly through executive networks about the situation at Meridian, and none of the Fortune 500 companies wanted to be associated with what looked like a chaotic and potentially untrustworthy service provider. But there was something else Jennifer mentioned that caught my attention. "Jake, I have to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Did you really try to steal client information? Or is there something else going on here?" I assured her that the allegations were completely false, and she seemed to believe me. I thought so. The whole thing felt off from the beginning. Richard Blackwood's explanation didn't match the Jake Morrison I've been working with for the past 6 months. "You've been nothing but professional and transparent in all our dealings." After hanging up with Jennifer, I called Tom Bradley at Coastal Energy. His story was almost identical. A call from Blackwood with accusations about my conduct, followed by a realization that Meridian wasn't prepared to handle the transition, followed by a board decision to terminate the contract. By the time I finished calling all 12 clients, the picture was crystal clear. Blackwood had tried to preemptively poison my reputation to prevent the clients from following me if I left the company. But his heavy-handed approach had backfired spectacularly. Instead of securing the client relationships for Meridian, he'd destroyed them entirely. The irony was staggering. In trying to prevent me from taking the clients with me, Blackwood had guaranteed that the clients would leave anyway. Except now. They were leaving without me having anywhere to take them. That afternoon, I got a call from Patricia. She'd heard about the mass client defections and wanted to meet immediately. We agreed to meet at the same coffee shop where we'd talked before. Patricia looked exhausted when she arrived, like she hadn't slept in days. "Jake, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it. I've been getting pressure from Blackwood to sign a statement saying that I had concerns about your client management practices. He wants me to provide documentation to support the allegations they've made against you. Are you going to do it?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew the answer. "Hell no. But I wanted you to know what's happening so you can protect yourself. This isn't over. Blackwood is panicking because he's lost $38 million in contracts, and he's looking for someone to blame besides himself." Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. "I've been copying every email, every document, every piece of communication related to your Fortune 500 deals for the past 2 months. I had a feeling something like this might happen, so I wanted to make sure there was a record of what actually occurred." She slid the flash drive across the table. "Everything is on there. Client communications, internal memos, project documentation, even recordings of some of the meetings where Blackwood was planning this whole thing." I stared at the flash drive, realizing that Patricia had just handed me the evidence I'd need to clear my name and potentially take legal action against Meridian. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Because what they did to you is wrong, and because I know that if they can do it to you, they can do it to anyone. I've been with this company for 8 years, Jake. I've seen Blackwood make a lot of questionable decisions, but this crosses a line." That evening, I spent hours going through the files Patricia had given me. The evidence was damning. There were email chains where Blackwood and Marcus Chen discussed strategies for managing the Jake situation. There were documents outlining plans to redistribute client relationships to reduce single points of failure. Most shocking of all, there was a recording of a meeting where Blackwood explicitly stated that he needed to neutralize Jake's influence before he gets too powerful. The files also contained something I hadn't expected: evidence that Blackwood had been having financial problems with the company for months before I landed the Fortune 500 contracts. Meridian was bleeding money due to some bad investments Blackwood had made in office expansion and personnel. The Fortune 500 contracts hadn't just been a growth opportunity, they'd been a lifeline for a company that was quietly heading toward bankruptcy. Now, with all those contracts canceled, Meridian was in an even worse position than before. The company had taken on additional overhead and debt based on the expectation of the Fortune 500 revenue, and without that income, they were looking at potential insolvency within 6 months. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by printouts and documents, I realized that Blackwood's betrayal had accomplished something he never intended. By forcing me out and losing the clients in the process, he'd actually created an opportunity for me that wouldn't have existed otherwise. All 12 Fortune 500 companies had canceled their contracts not because they were unhappy with the work, but because they'd lost confidence in Meridian as an organization. But they still had the same problems that had led them to sign contracts in the first place. They still needed the solutions I'd proposed, and they still trusted me personally to deliver those solutions. The question was whether I had the courage and resources to go out on my own and try to win them back as an independent consultant. It would mean taking on established competitors with decades of experience and millions in resources. It would mean risking everything on my ability to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by Blackwood's sabotage. But as I looked at the evidence Patricia had given me, I realized I might not have a choice. Blackwood wasn't going to stop with just forcing me out of Meridian. He was actively trying to destroy my reputation in the industry to prevent me from competing with him. If I didn't fight back, I might never work in consulting again. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was Jennifer Walsh at Pinnacle Industries. The second was to a lawyer. The lawyer I called was Amanda Pierce, a partner at Steinberg & Associates who specialized in employment law and corporate disputes. I'd gotten her name from a former colleague who'd gone through a wrongful termination case 2 years earlier. Amanda had a reputation for being thorough, aggressive, and expensive, exactly what I needed. Her downtown office was impressive in that understated way that screams competence and success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan, and the conference room where we met was lined with legal texts and framed certificates from various bar associations. Amanda listened without interruption as I walked through the entire timeline, from the Vegas conference to the client cancellations. I handed over Patricia's flash drive and printed copies of the most damaging documents. When I finished talking, she leaned back in her leather chair and was quiet for almost a full minute. "Jake, I need to be direct with you about something," she finally said. "What happened to you is clearly wrongful termination, and we have strong evidence of conspiracy and defamation. But pursuing this case is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Are you prepared for a fight that could last 18 months or longer?" I told her I was, though honestly, I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. I'd never been involved in litigation before, and my understanding of the legal system came mostly from TV shows. "There's another consideration," Amanda continued. "Richard Blackwood and Meridian are going to fight this aggressively because they can't afford to lose. If we win a significant judgment against them, it could force the company into bankruptcy. That means they're going to throw everything they have at discrediting you and your claims." She explained that we had several potential causes of action: wrongful termination, defamation, intentional interference with business relationships, and possibly fraud. The challenge would be proving damages, since I'd only been out of work for a few days and hadn't yet lost any income beyond my reduced salary. "However," Amanda said with the first smile I'd seen from her, "if you're serious about starting your own consulting firm and trying to win back those Fortune 500 clients, we might be able to frame this differently. Instead of just seeking compensation for past damages, we could seek injunctive relief to prevent Meridian from continuing to interfere with your business relationships." That afternoon, Jennifer Walsh called me back with news that would change the entire trajectory of the case. "Jake, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to make you an offer. Pinnacle still needs the services we originally contracted for with Meridian. If you're willing to take on the project independently, we'd like to work with you directly." I explained that I was considering starting my own firm but wasn't set up yet to handle a project of that scale. "We understand that, and we're willing to be flexible on timing and structure. What matters to us is working with someone we trust who understands our specific needs. We never wanted to work with Meridian as a company. We wanted to work with you." By the end of that call, Jennifer had outlined the terms of a potential new contract. Pinnacle would pay me directly for the same services they'd originally contracted with Meridian, but at a 20% higher rate to account for the additional overhead I'd face as an independent contractor. The total value would be just over $5 million. Before I could fully process what Jennifer had offered, my phone rang again. This time it was Tom Bradley from Coastal Energy with a nearly identical proposal. Then, Atlantic Retail Group called, then Midwest Financial Services. Over the next 3 days, all 12 Fortune 500 companies reached out to discuss working with me independently. The combined value of the contracts they were offering was $46 million, $8 million more than the original Meridian deals. Amanda Pierce was fascinated by this development when I called to update her. "Jake, this changes our legal strategy completely. We're no longer just dealing with wrongful termination. We're dealing with tortious interference with prospective business advantage. Meridian's actions didn't just cost you a job, they cost you the opportunity to earn tens of millions of dollars in revenue." She explained that if we could prove Meridian had intentionally sabotaged my relationships with these clients to prevent me from competing with them, the damages calculation would be astronomical. Instead of seeking a few $100,000 in compensation, We could be looking at a multi-million-dollar case. But there was a catch. To accept the contracts from my former clients, I'd need to start a legitimate consulting business immediately. That meant incorporating, getting insurance, hiring staff, and setting up all the infrastructure necessary to deliver Fortune 500 level services. It also meant taking on the risk that Meridian would escalate their efforts to destroy my reputation and business prospects. I spent the weekend doing financial projections and risk assessments. Starting a consulting firm with 12 major clients already lined up was an incredible opportunity, but it was also terrifying. I'd never run a business before, and the stakes couldn't be higher. On Monday morning, I made the decision that would define the next phase of my life. I called Jennifer Walsh and accepted Pinnacle's offer, with the understanding that I'd need 30 days to get my new company operational. Then I called the other 11 clients and made similar commitments. By Tuesday, I'd filed incorporation, papers for Morrison Strategic Solutions, and signed a lease on office space in the same downtown district where Meridian was located. The irony of potentially competing directly with my former employer from just a few blocks away wasn't lost on me. The business setup process was more complicated than I'd anticipated. I needed professional liability insurance, which required extensive documentation of my experience and qualifications. I needed to establish banking relationships, set up accounting systems, and create all the legal agreements necessary to hire contractors and employees. But the most challenging aspect was building a team. To deliver on 12 Fortune 500 contracts simultaneously, I'd need experienced consultants, project managers, and support staff. The problem was that most of the qualified people I knew were either working for competitors or had connections to Meridian that could create conflicts of interest. That's when Patricia made an offer I hadn't expected. "Jake, I want to join you at Morrison Strategic. I'm done with Blackwood and the toxic culture he's created at Meridian. If you're serious about building something better, I want to be part of it." Patricia brought more than just experience. She brought credibility and relationships that would be crucial for establishing the new firm. She also brought inside knowledge of how Meridian operated and where their weaknesses were. Within 2 weeks, we'd assembled a core team of 6 senior consultants, including Patricia and 3 other former Meridian employees who'd become disgusted with Blackwood's leadership. We also hired a business development manager, an operations coordinator, and 2 junior analysts. The defections from Meridian created exactly the kind of chaos I'd expected. Blackwood was furious that Patricia had joined me, and he immediately implemented new non-compete agreements for all remaining employees. He also started spreading rumors in industry circles that Morrison Strategic was built on stolen intellectual property and client lists. Amanda Pierce had warned me this would happen, and we were prepared. Every employee who joined Morrison Strategic had signed affidavits stating they'd brought no proprietary information from their previous employers. We'd also documented our client relationships extensively, showing they were based on legitimate business connections rather than misappropriated contacts. 3 weeks after founding Morrison Strategic, I got a call that I'd been half expecting and half dreading. It was Marcus Chen from Meridian, but he wasn't calling to threaten or harass me. He was calling to ask for a job. "Jake, I need to be honest with you about something. The situation at Meridian is worse than you probably realize. We're looking at bankruptcy within 90 days if we can't replace the revenue from those Fortune 500 contracts. Blackwood is scrambling to find someone to blame, and he's making decisions that are destroying what's left of the company." Marcus explained that Meridian had laid off over half their staff in the past 2 weeks. The remaining employees were actively looking for other jobs, and several major clients were reconsidering their contracts due to concerns about the company's stability. "I know you have every reason to hate me for what happened, but I want you to know that the whole executive team was under enormous pressure from Blackwood. None of us wanted to handle the situation the way we did." I appreciated Marcus's honesty, but I wasn't ready to forgive or forget what had happened. However, His call did give me valuable intelligence about Meridian's deteriorating situation, which could be useful for our legal case. By the end of my first month as an independent consultant, Morrison Strategic had signed contracts with all 12 of my former clients and had begun preliminary work on several projects. The Pinnacle Industries engagement was already showing promising results, and Jennifer Walsh had mentioned us to executives at other manufacturing companies who might need similar services. But just as things were starting to stabilize, Blackwood made a move that caught everyone off guard. Amanda Pierce called me on a Friday afternoon with news that would escalate our legal battle to a completely different level. "Jake, we just received a lawsuit filing from Meridian's attorneys. They're suing you, Patricia, and Morrison Strategic for conspiracy, theft of trade secrets, tortious interference, and breach of fiduciary duty. They're seeking $50 million in damages and an injunction that would prevent you from working in the consulting industry for 5 years." I sat down heavily in my new office chair, staring out at the Chicago skyline, while Amanda explained the details of Meridian's counterstrike. "They're claiming that you and Patricia conspired while you were still employed at Meridian to steal client relationships and proprietary methodologies. They're also alleging that the other employees who joined Morrison Strategic violated their employment agreements by soliciting clients on your behalf." The lawsuit was clearly a desperation move by Blackwood, but it was also dangerous. Even if we ultimately won, the legal fees and time required to defend against such serious allegations could destroy Morrison Strategic before we had a chance to establish ourselves. "There's something else," Amanda continued. "Blackwood has hired Brennan and Associates to represent Meridian. They're one of the most aggressive litigation firms in the city, and they specialize in destroying small businesses that compete with their corporate clients." That weekend, I found myself questioning whether I'd made the right decision in starting Morrison Strategic. The stress of running a new business while defending against a major lawsuit was overwhelming, and I was starting to understand why most people choose the security of traditional employment over the risks of entrepreneurship. But on Monday morning, something happened that reminded me why I'd taken this path in the first place. Jennifer Walsh called with an update on the Pinnacle Industries project. The preliminary results from our pilot program were so impressive that her board had approved expanding the engagement to all 12 of their manufacturing facilities. Instead of the original $4.2 million contract, they wanted to sign a new agreement worth $12 million over 3 years. "Jake, I want you to know that choosing to work with you independently was the best business decision we've made this year. Your team's approach is exactly what we needed, and the results speak for themselves." Similar calls came in from 3 other clients over the next 2 days. The quality of our work was exceeding expectations, and word was spreading in executive circles about Morrison Strategic's capabilities. By the end of my second month in business, we had over $60 million in confirmed contracts and a waiting list of potential clients. The legal battle with Meridian was far from over, but I was starting to feel confident that we could fight and win while simultaneously building a successful business. The real test would come when we had to defend our practices and our success in court. Blackwood was betting that he could use the legal system to destroy what I'd built, but he'd underestimated both my determination and the strength of the relationships I'd developed with my clients. As I prepared for what would likely be a long and expensive legal fight, I couldn't help but think about how differently things might have turned out if Blackwood had simply promoted me and given me equity in Meridian, instead of trying to sabotage my career. His greed and insecurity had cost him everything he'd worked to build, while inadvertently giving me the opportunity to build something even bigger and better. Sometimes the best revenge really is massive success. The discovery phase of litigation is supposed to be a methodical process where both sides exchange evidence and build their cases. What I discovered about Richard Blackwood and Meridian Solutions during those months of depositions and document requests was far more shocking than anything I'd imagined when this whole nightmare began. Amanda Pierce had assembled a legal team that included 2 associate attorneys and a forensic accountant named Robert Kim. Robert's job was to analyze Meridian's financial records and trace the flow of money through the company's accounts. What he found in the first week of discovery made Amanda call an emergency meeting. "Jake, we need to talk about what Robert uncovered in Meridian's books. This case just became about a lot more than wrongful termination and defamation." Robert spread financial documents across the conference table, pointing to highlighted sections that meant nothing to me but clearly had significant implications. "Meridian has been operating essentially as a Ponzi scheme for the past 18 months, Robert explained. "Blackwood has been using revenue from new client contracts to pay expenses that should have been covered by cash flow from existing projects. He showed me bank statements revealing that Meridian had borrowed heavily against future receivables, meaning they'd already spent money from contracts that hadn't been completed yet. When my Fortune 500 deals were canceled, it didn't just eliminate future revenue. It created immediate cash flow problems because the company had already spent that money. But here's the really interesting part," Robert continued. "Blackwood has been siphoning money from company accounts into personal investments. Over the past year, he's transferred nearly $2 million from Meridian's operating account into a real estate development project he's involved in personally." Amanda looked across the table at me with an expression I was learning to recognize. It was the look she got when she'd found something that would fundamentally change our legal strategy. "Jake, we're not just dealing with employment law violations anymore. We're looking at potential embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. If we can prove that Blackwood sabotaged your career to cover up his own financial misconduct, this becomes a criminal matter." The implications were staggering. Blackwood hadn't just been protecting his ego when he forced me out of Meridian, he'd been protecting himself from criminal liability. My success had made me a potential witness to financial irregularities that could have sent him to prison. Over the next 2 weeks, our legal team subpoenaed 5 years of Meridian's financial records, email archives, and phone logs. The picture that emerged was of a company that had been mismanaged almost from its founding, with Blackwood consistently prioritizing his personal financial interests over the company's long-term viability. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Marcus Chen, who had left Meridian 2 weeks after our phone conversation, reached out to Amanda's office with information that would blow the case wide open. We met Marcus at a restaurant in Naperville, far enough from downtown Chicago that we were unlikely to run into anyone from our industry. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept properly in months and had lost significant weight since I'd last seen him. "I need to tell you something that's been eating at me since this whole thing started," Marcus began after we'd ordered coffee. "The reason Blackwood was so determined to get rid of you wasn't just about the client relationships. He was terrified that you'd discover what he'd been doing with the company's finances." Marcus explained that as regional director, he'd had access to financial reports that most employees never saw. He'd started noticing discrepancies between reported revenues and actual cash flow months before my Fortune 500 deals were signed. "When you brought in those contracts, Blackwood saw an opportunity to solve his cash flow problems temporarily, but he also realized that someone with your level of access to client relationships and project budgets would eventually notice that the numbers didn't add up." Marcus pulled out a folder containing photocopies of internal financial reports that showed systematic manipulation of revenue recognition and expense allocation. Blackwood had been inflating reported profits by recognizing revenue from contracts that were nowhere near completion, while hiding expenses by categorizing personal expenditures as business costs. "The salary cut wasn't really about limiting your earning potential," Marcus continued. "It was about reducing your access level within the company. At your reduced position, you wouldn't have had authorization to review financial reports or approve large expenditures. Blackwood was trying to keep you around to maintain client relationships while preventing you from seeing the bigger picture." Amanda had been taking notes throughout Marcus's explanation, and I could see her already formulating how this information would reshape our legal strategy. "Marcus, are you willing to testify about this in court?" she asked. "Yes, but there's Something else you need to know. I'm not the only former Meridian employee who's aware of these issues. At least 6 other people have documentation of Blackwood's financial misconduct, and they're all willing to cooperate with your investigation. That meeting with Marcus marked a turning point in our case. What had started as a wrongful termination lawsuit was now a comprehensive investigation into corporate fraud and embezzlement. Amanda immediately contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office to report potential federal crimes while continuing to build our civil case. Meanwhile, Morrison Strategic was thriving despite the legal distractions. Our team had grown to 15 full-time employees, and we'd moved to larger office space to accommodate our expansion. The contracts with my former Fortune 500 clients were generating steady revenue, and referrals were bringing in new business faster than we could handle it. Jennifer Walsh had become an unofficial spokesperson for Morrison Strategic, referring executives from other companies and speaking positively about our work at industry conferences. The contrast between our growing success and Meridian's continuing decline was becoming impossible to ignore. But Blackwood wasn't going down without a fight. His attorneys at Brennan & Associates were pursuing an aggressive litigation strategy designed to drain our resources and distract us from running our business. They filed motion after motion, requested extension after extension, and generally tried to make the legal process as expensive and time-consuming as possible. The depositions were particularly brutal. Blackwood's attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Victoria Brennan, spent 8 hours trying to get me to admit that I'd planned to steal Meridian's clients from the beginning. She questioned every conversation I'd had with clients, every email I'd sent, and every decision I'd made during my time at the company. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you specifically targeted Fortune 500 companies because you knew they would be more likely to follow you if you left Meridian? She asked during hour 6 of my deposition. No, that's not true. I targeted Fortune 500 companies because Meridian had never successfully landed contracts of that size before, and I saw it as an opportunity to help the company grow. But you must have realized that developing such close personal relationships with these executives would give you leverage if you decided to leave the company, Amanda objected, but I answered anyway. I developed professional relationships with clients because that's how successful consulting works. Every account manager at every firm in this industry tries to build trust and rapport with their clients. The depositions went on for weeks, with Victoria Brennan trying every angle she could think of to make our business relationships look inappropriate or unethical. But the evidence didn't support her theories, and it was becoming clear that Meridian's case was built more on desperation than on facts. When it was time for Blackwood's deposition, Amanda went on the offensive. Armed with the financial evidence Robert Kim had analyzed and the testimony Marcus Chen had provided, she systematically dismantled Blackwood's credibility. Mr. Blackwood, can you explain why your company transferred nearly $2 million from operating accounts to a real estate investment project that you personally owned a stake in? Blackwood's face went red, and he looked to his attorney for guidance before answering. Those were legitimate business investments approved by the board of directors. According to the board meeting minutes we've reviewed, there's no record of any vote authorizing these transfers. Are you suggesting the board approved these investments without documenting their decision? The deposition continued for 2 days, with Blackwood becoming increasingly defensive and contradictory in his answers. By the end, it was clear that his version of events didn't match the documentary evidence, and his credibility as a witness was severely damaged. But the real breakthrough came when we deposed Sandra Mills, the HR director who had been involved in my termination. Sandra had been with Meridian since its early days and had maintained detailed records of all personnel decisions. Under oath, she revealed information that even Amanda hadn't expected. Ms. Mills, in your 15 years of HR experience, have you ever seen a situation where an employee's salary was reduced by 70% for performance reasons? No, never. Salary reductions of that magnitude are typically associated with demotions to entry-level positions or disciplinary actions for serious misconduct. In Mr. Morrison's case, was there any documented performance issue or misconduct that would justify such a reduction? Sandra looked uncomfortable, glancing toward Meridian's attorneys before answering. No, there was no documented performance issue. Mr. Morrison's performance reviews were consistently excellent. Then why was his salary reduced? Mr. Blackwood told me it was a strategic decision to change his compensation structure, but I was not provided with documentation supporting that explanation. Amanda pressed further. Ms. Mills, did Mr. Blackwood ever discuss with you the possibility that Mr. Morrison might leave the company and take clients with him? Yes, he mentioned that concern several times in the weeks before Mr. Morrison's termination. Did he ask you to find a legal justification for terminating Mr. Morrison? Sandra hesitated for a long moment before answering. He asked me to review Mr. Morrison's client communications to see if there was anything that could be characterized as inappropriate or potentially harmful to the company. And what did your review find? Nothing inappropriate. Mr. Morrison's client communications were professional and well within normal parameters for account management. Yet Mr. Blackwood proceeded with the disciplinary action anyway? Yes. That exchange effectively ended Meridian's case. Sandra Mills had just testified under oath that Blackwood had manipulated the HR process to manufacture justification for my termination, despite knowing that no legitimate grounds existed. 2 weeks after Sandra's deposition, Victoria Brennan called Amanda to discuss settlement. Meridian was finally ready to acknowledge that their lawsuit was unwinnable, but they were hoping to negotiate terms that would minimize their financial exposure. The settlement discussions revealed just how desperate Meridian's situation had become. The company was facing potential bankruptcy, federal criminal investigation, and lawsuits from several other former employees who had learned about Blackwood's misconduct. They needed to resolve our case quickly to avoid a public trial that would expose the full extent of the fraud. Amanda came to me with Meridian's initial settlement offer. They would drop their lawsuit against Morrison Strategic and pay us $500,000 in damages, in exchange for our agreement not to pursue criminal charges against Blackwood personally. Jake, I need to be clear about something. This offer is insulting given the strength of our case and the damage they've caused to your reputation. But there are strategic considerations we need to discuss. She explained that accepting a quick settlement would allow us to focus fully on growing Morrison Strategic without the continued distraction and expense of litigation. On the other hand, taking the case to trial could result in a much larger financial judgment and would ensure that Blackwood faced consequences for his actions. What's your recommendation? I asked. Amanda smiled. I think we should reject their offer and make a counteroffer that reflects the true value of this case. Based on the evidence we've uncovered, I believe we can get a judgment in the 8-figure range if we go to trial. That afternoon, we submitted our counteroffer. $12 million in damages, a public apology acknowledging that the allegations against me were false, and Blackwood's agreement to never work in the consulting industry again. The response came back within 24 hours. Victoria Brennan wanted to schedule another settlement conference, which could only mean one thing. Meridian knew they were beaten, and now it was just a matter of negotiating the terms of their surrender. The settlement conference took place on a gray Tuesday morning in February at the offices of Chicago's federal courthouse. The room was sterile and institutional, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Across the table sat Richard Blackwood, Victoria Brennan, and 2 other attorneys from Brennan & Associates. Blackwood looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 6 months. His hair had gone completely gray, and he'd developed a nervous tic where he was constantly adjusted his tie. Federal Magistrate Judge Helen Rodriguez presided over the conference, making it clear from the outset that she'd reviewed our case file extensively and wasn't interested in wasting time on procedural games. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here because the plaintiff in this case has filed what appears to be a frivolous lawsuit while facing serious allegations of financial misconduct. Mr. Brennan, I've read your client's complaint, and frankly, I'm struggling. to understand how it survived a motion to dismiss. Victoria Brennan stood to respond, but Judge Rodriguez held up her hand. Before you answer, I want to address the elephant in the room. Mr. Blackwood, are you aware that the U.S. Attorney's Office has opened a criminal investigation into your business practices? Blackwood's face went white. Your Honor, we're not prepared to discuss any potential criminal matters in this forum. I'm not asking you to discuss them. I'm asking if you're aware that they exist because it seems relevant to whether this civil case should proceed or be stayed pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The rest of the morning was a masterclass in judicial efficiency. Judge Rodriguez methodically dismantled Meridian's case while making it clear that she viewed their lawsuit as an abuse of the legal system. By lunch break, even Victoria Brennan seemed to understand that continuing to trial would be professional suicide. During the afternoon session, we presented our counter-evidence. Amanda had prepared a timeline showing how Blackwood's financial misconduct predated my arrival at Meridian by 18 months, making it impossible for me to have been involved in any conspiracy. Robert Kim presented a forensic analysis proving that the money Blackwood had embezzled could have covered the company's operational expenses for over a year. But the most powerful moment came when Patricia took the stand to testify about the recordings she'd made of Blackwood's planning sessions. Ms. Hendricks, can you tell the court what Mr. Blackwood said during the meeting on September 15th regarding his plans for Mr. Morrison? Patricia looked directly at Blackwood as she answered. He said, and I quote, "Jake is becoming too popular with the Fortune 500 clients. If he figures out what's been going on with our finances, he could destroy everything I've built. We need to neutralize him before he gets too powerful." Did he elaborate on what he meant by neutralize? Yes. He outlined a plan to reduce Jake's salary and access level, then systematically poison his relationships with clients by spreading false allegations about his conduct. And what was his stated goal in doing this? To either force Jake to quit voluntarily or create grounds for termination that would prevent him from competing with Meridian in the future. Blackwood's attorney tried to object, but Judge Rodriguez overruled her. The witness may continue. Patricia went on to describe 3 separate meetings where Blackwood had discussed strategies for removing me from the company while maintaining control over my client relationships. The recordings were played in open court, and hearing Blackwood's voice plotting my professional destruction was surreal. After Patricia's testimony, Judge Rodriguez called a recess and asked both legal teams to meet with her privately. When we returned to the courtroom 20 minutes later, she made an announcement that effectively ended the case. After reviewing the evidence presented today, this court finds that the plaintiff's claims are not only without merit, but appear to have been filed in bad faith as part of a continuing pattern of harassment against the defendant. Mr. Blackwood, your lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, and you are hereby ordered to pay Mr. Morrison's legal fees and costs. Victoria Brennan immediately stood to object, but Judge Rodriguez cut her off. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Illinois State Bar for investigation of potential sanctions against counsel for bringing a frivolous lawsuit. This case should never have been filed, and the court's time should not have been wasted on such obvious abuse of process. The monetary award wasn't the $12 million we'd asked for, but Judge Rodriguez ordered Meridian to pay our legal fees, which totaled nearly $400,000, plus punitive damages of $2 million for the bad faith lawsuit. More importantly, the judge's ruling included injunctive relief preventing Blackwood or anyone acting on his behalf from making defamatory statements about me or interfering with my business relationships. Violating that injunction would result in immediate contempt of court charges and potential jail time. As we walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, Amanda turned to me with the biggest smile I'd seen from her since we'd started working together. "Jake, I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've never seen a judge dress down a litigant quite like that. Rodriguez basically called Blackwood a criminal and his attorney incompetent in open court. the victory felt anticlimactic after months of stress and preparation. I'd expected to feel more satisfaction, but mostly I just felt exhausted and ready to focus on building my business without legal distractions. The real vindication came over the following weeks, as news of the court rulings spread through Chicago's business community. The legal trade publications picked up the story, and Judge Rodriguez's harsh words for Blackwood became industry gossip. Several potential clients who had been hesitant to work with Morrison Strategic because of Meridian's allegations suddenly became very interested in our services. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the court ruling, I got a call from FBI Special Agent Maria Santos, who was leading the federal investigation into Meridian's financial crimes. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation with our investigation. The evidence your legal team provided has been instrumental in building our case against Mr. Blackwood." She explained that the financial documents Robert Kim had analyzed, combined with Marcus Chen's testimony and Patricia's recordings, had given federal prosecutors everything they needed to pursue criminal charges. Blackwood was facing potential prison time for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. "I also wanted to let you know that we've recovered most of the money Mr. Blackwood stole from Meridian. While the company will likely still face bankruptcy, the recovered funds will help compensate other victims of his fraud." 2 weeks later, Blackwood was arrested at his home in Winnetka on federal charges. The perp walk made the evening news, and seeing him in handcuffs was more satisfying than any civil court victory could have been. Meridian Solutions filed for bankruptcy protection the following month. The company's assets were liquidated to pay creditors, and the remaining employees were laid off with minimal severance. Patricia and I attended the bankruptcy auction, where office furniture and equipment were sold for pennies on the dollar. "It's hard to believe this is how it ends," Patricia said as we watched Blackwood's expensive office furniture being carted away by bargain hunters. "This isn't how it ends," I replied. "This is how it began." Morrison Strategic had grown to 35 employees by the 1-year anniversary of my termination from Meridian. Our client roster included 23 Fortune 500 companies, and we were consistently ranked among the top boutique consulting firms in the Midwest. The financial success was gratifying, but what meant more to me was the culture we'd built. Unlike Meridian's cutthroat environment, Morrison Strategic emphasized collaboration, transparency, and ethical business practices. We'd implemented profit sharing for all employees, comprehensive healthcare benefits, and a sabbatical program that encouraged people to pursue continuing education. Jennifer Walsh from Pinnacle Industries had become one of our biggest advocates, serving on our advisory board and helping us develop new service offerings. The pilot program we'd started 18 months earlier had grown into a comprehensive partnership that was saving Pinnacle millions of dollars annually. "Jake, I want you to know that choosing to work with you independently was one of the best decisions our company has ever made," Jennifer told me during a quarterly review meeting. "Not just because of the results you've delivered, but because of how you've conducted business. You've set a standard that other consultants struggle to match." The recognition in our industry was equally rewarding. I was invited to speak at the same National Business Development Conference where I'd first met these clients, but this time as a successful entrepreneur rather than an ambitious employee. The contrast wasn't lost on me as I stood on the stage at the Bellagio, looking out at an audience of executives and consultants. 2 years ago, I was sitting in the audience at this conference, hoping to land a few new clients for my employer. I began my keynote address. I never imagined that those conversations would lead to starting my own firm, fighting a federal fraud case, and ultimately building something bigger and better than I'd ever dreamed possible. I talked about the importance of ethical business practices, the value of genuine client relationships, and the dangers of short-term thinking that prioritizes personal gain over long-term success. I didn't mention Blackwood by name, but everyone in the audience understood the subtext. The speech was well received, and I was approached afterward by dozens of executives interested in learning more about Morrison Strategic's approach to consulting. We signed 3 new clients that weekend, and the conference organizers invited me to deliver the opening keynote the following year. 6 months later, I received news that brought the Blackwood saga to its final conclusion. Special Agent Santos called to inform me that he had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his financial crimes. The judge had rejected his attorney's plea for leniency, citing the sophisticated and prolonged nature of the defendant's criminal conduct. Mr. Morrison, I wanted you to know that the judge specifically mentioned your case during sentencing. She said that Mr. Blackwood's attempt to destroy your career while covering up his own crimes demonstrated a complete lack of remorse and a willingness to harm innocent people to protect himself. That evening, I called Patricia with the news. She was quiet for a moment before responding. You know, Jake, I used to feel sorry for Richard. I thought he was just a businessman who made some bad decisions under pressure. But after everything we learned during the investigation, I realize he was never the person I thought he was. The Richard Blackwood who started Meridian might have been legitimate, but somewhere along the way, he became something else entirely. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm struck by how a single moment of corporate betrayal led to opportunities I never could have imagined. If Blackwood had simply given me a raise and promotion instead of cutting my salary, I'd probably still be working for Meridian today, helping him cover up his crimes without even realizing it. His greed and paranoia destroyed his company, sent him to prison, and inadvertently created the circumstances that allowed me to build something much better. Morrison Strategic was now generating more revenue annually than Meridian ever had, and we were doing it while maintaining the highest ethical standards and treating our employees with respect. 3 years after that devastating Tuesday morning when my salary was cut by 70%, I was named Chicago Business Journal's Entrepreneur of the Year. The award ceremony was held at the Palmer House, just a few blocks from where Meridian's offices used to be. During my acceptance speech, I talked about the importance of perseverance, the value of ethical business practices, and the unexpected opportunities that can arise from professional setbacks. I thanked Patricia, Amanda Pierce, and all the clients who had supported Morrison Strategic during its early days. But mostly, I talked about the lesson I'd learned from the entire experience, that success built on integrity and genuine relationships is not only more satisfying than success built on manipulation and fraud, but it's also more sustainable and ultimately more profitable. As I looked out at the audience that night, I saw Jennifer Walsh from Pinnacle Industries, Marcus Chen, who now worked for one of our competitors, and even Sandra Mills, who had started her own HR consulting firm after Meridian's bankruptcy. What I didn't see, and would never see again in any professional context, was Richard Blackwood. He was serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Indiana, and when he was eventually released, the conditions of his plea agreement would prevent him from working in the consulting industry ever again. Sometimes the best revenge really is massive success. But more than that, sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the best thing that ever happened to you, if you have the courage to turn betrayal into opportunity and use adversity as motivation to build something better than what came before. Morrison Strategic Solutions continues to grow and thrive today. And every morning when I walk into our offices, I'm reminded that integrity isn't just the right way to do business. It's the only way to build something that lasts. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.